compassionate empathy really blends the two and has this drive to take action, the willingness to help, this urge to help. And while emotional empathy is about sharing emotions, as we said, cognitive empathy is about understanding the emotions. And compassionate empathy is then about acting to make a difference. Hi, and welcome to Lead Well. Hi, now let's talk about empathy. Would you consider yourself an empath? Someone who is really empathetic toward other people? I certainly have done that. And I was sure I knew what empathy was until just recently when I came across an article from my research circle that talked about the supposed lack of empathy in people with autism spectrum disorder. The article said that, in fact, that is a misinterpretation of the concept of empathy. And wow, that made me think. So I found out I really didn't know it all. And I didn't understand that there were different types of empathy. Why does this matter? Because every single type of empathy has a different implication of how we interact with others. And of course, empathy overall is really important for our relationships, for how we can build connections with other people. Now, let's look into those three forms of empathy. There is something called emotional empathy, cognitive empathy, and compassionate empathy. But before we go into all three, let's have a look at a definition of empathy by Carl Rogers, who is an American psychologist who is well known for developing the client-centered therapy. So a therapy that really puts the client, the patient, in the focus, in the center. And Carl Rogers said, and I'll read that to you, empathy is the ability to perceive the internal frame of reference of another with accuracy and with the emotional components and meanings which pertain thereto as if one were the person, but without ever losing the as if condition. Now, it is about perception, understanding of what's going on in the other person, always being aware that we are perceiving it, we are observing it. So it's not our own emotions, for example, that we're feeling, but it's what we're seeing in others and perceiving in others. Now, let's start with this emotional empathy. To me, that really was the one that I thought was empathy overall. So emotional empathy as being the capacity to feel what another person is feeling, to being able to connect. Actually, if you're familiar with the trust technique that I'm also practicing, this technique where we build upon the notion that not only humans and humans share feelings, but also animals and humans share feelings. This is exactly it. This is emotional empathy. I am feeling the feelings of the other person. I'm feeling the emotions of the other person. Often that's an instinct. We call that intuition. I'm looking at another person and suddenly I'm feeling sad. When I talk to someone and this other person starts to laugh, I cannot help but laugh with them. If someone smiles at me, I cannot help but smile back. And the same is true when someone starts crying. It's very hard for me to go to the cinema because, yeah, I can only go at night because otherwise I get out and everyone sees that I've been crying, because every single movie really makes me cry because I so connect to the actors and I'm so involved in them and I so feel what's going on there. So of course, there is a huge benefit of being able to do that, of being able to feeling what another person is feeling, because it builds a strong sense of connection. And the person who is actually experiencing this emotion that I'm then picking up feels seen and understood, because we are communicating on the same level then, because we can look at things through the same type of lens. So at this point in time, we experience the same emotions. We have the same feelings. We literally feel bonded through that. The drawback is, if I'm a really emotionally empathetic person, there is the danger of getting exhausted by that. Because think about it. For example, I cannot look at any movies where there is aggression or where someone is threatened, because I feel immediately impacted by that. And would I work in an environment as a therapist, for example, where I had a lot of patients going through difficult periods, and me picking up on all those emotions, that would feel draining. And there is this of empathy fatigue that a lot of people experience when they are in a caring profession. Also, when they deal with animals, for example, people working in shelters, that happens to them quite often. That is because they can get really involved, and they might get too involved in what they are feeling, experiencing when they get in contact with other beings. So that's about the emotional empathy. Now, what is another form of empathy? That is called cognitive empathy. And cognitive empathy happens here, happens in my prefrontal cortex. So the part of the brain where reasoning happens, where thinking about other perspectives happens. Cognitive empathy really is the ability to understand what another person might be thinking without feeling it myself. So because I'm seeing them going through an emotion, I can think about what they are feeling, what they might be feeling. So, for example, if I have a friend who has just recently lost a loved one, I understand that they are going through a very, very hard period of grief. I'm not necessarily feeling that grief myself, but I know how it feels because I have gone through that experience. Now, if I would jump upon this feeling and re-feel my grief for my example, when my parents died, then that would be, of course, the emotional empathy component. Me observing my friend and understanding, cognitively understanding that they're going through a difficult period, that is this cognitive empathy. And this helps a lot with then problem solving, because I am not emotionally involved. I can provide perspectives. I can provide visions of solutions. It also helps with negotiation. So if I understand the perspective, the position of the other person, I have an easier time to negotiate with them. And also for leadership, this type of empathy is probably the most important one, because I can anticipate how others might feel. So if I have an employee, for example, who is getting overwhelmed, I can start thinking about that and understanding that and finding a solution, strategizing with them to find a solution so that they can feel more in control of what they're doing without getting the overwhelming feeling myself. The drawback of cognitive empathy is that if this is done by someone who has very little emotional empathy, it can seem cold. It can seem detached. It can seem what in positive intelligence we call a hyper rational, who always tries to find a rational explanation to give you a fact based approach to everything, which doesn't always help if I'm emotionally involved. So that is why you probably understand having one or the other is not really helpful. It's really good to have a balanced ability to be empathetic emotionally, but also cognitively. Now, I talked about this article that I just recently read, and this actually is indicating that people on the autism spectrum have a very high emotional empathy. This is also why they create really strong bonds with individuals because they can really empathize with them. They really feel those emotions, but they lack the cognitive empathy. I found it really interesting because I wasn't aware of that. And I was also not aware that there is actually a third form of empathy, and that is called compassionate empathy or the empathetic concern. This is more or less when you take the first two forms, empathetic and cognitive empathy, and don't stop there, because with those two, I only understand the other person. I feel with them, I understand them, but there is nothing happening. And so with compassionate empathy, I add that motivation to help them if needed. So I would definitely go into an emotional resonance with the other person. I will cognitively understand why they are in a situation, why they are feeling what they're feeling. But then I would have that drive to take action. Like if I'm reading a post from someone who is currently in a difficult situation, my first impulse is to reach out to them and say, hey, how can I help? I'm here. Even if it's just to listen, let me know what I can do. And I would do that over and over again because I personally feel that urge to say, well, okay, if there is a need, I want to make sure that the other person knows that I'm there. So, compassionate empathy, what it does, it prompts us to actually help the other person get better and improve their situation. It creates this supportive environment and hopefully makes the other person feel genuinely cared for. Now, let me compare all three. So, we said we have emotional empathy. And emotional empathy really is automatic, it's feeling based. I cannot help. If I'm an emotional empath, I'm seeing someone else, as I said, I'm going to the cinema, I'm seeing someone crying, I cry with them. Same if I go work with an animal, I pick those feelings up. We actually say that they are contagious. Those feelings, those emotions are contagious to some of us. Cognitive empathy is more deliberate. It's thought-based. I have to think about what is the perspective of the other person. And compassionate empathy really blends the two and has this drive to take action, the willingness to help, this urge to help. And while emotional empathy is about sharing emotions, as we said, cognitive empathy is about understanding the emotions. And compassionate empathy is then about acting to make a difference, acting to support and help the other person. So when we are using all three of them, we enable a really deep connection and an effective communication and also meaningful action. That, of course, is what we're all working towards. To have all three components and also have them in a way that is not hurtful to us. Because as I said before, we want to have some boundaries. We want to be mindful to take care of our own emotions, to take care of our own feelings, to make sure that we can continue to show us empathy towards others. So if you would want to become a more empathetic person, a more empathetic leader, what can you do? To strengthen your emotional empathy, what you can do is practice active listening. Listening without having the answer already in your mind, but listening with an open mind, open ears, and literally letting the other person talk and accepting the pauses without trying to chime in and offering solutions right away. And it also is a lot about self-reflection, literally understanding your own emotions, because that comes first. If I do not understand my own emotions, I cannot feel emotions from others. If I don't know my own natural, normal emotional state, I will not be able to understand, is this an emotion that comes from within me, or is this an emotion that I'm picking up from someone else? So active listening and self-reflection are really helpful to improve your emotional empathy. Cognitive empathy can also be trained. Practice taking another person's perspective. As we say, walk in their shoes and ask yourself the question, what might they be feeling in this situation? What might they be thinking in this situation? And if you do that with a very good friend, you can actually test that. You can make it a game. You can say, okay, now let me try to figure out what you're thinking. Let me try to figure out what you're feeling in this moment, and let's compare. This is a really fun game that helps you a lot to build this ability. And then compassionate empathy. Really engage in acts of kindness. Play the pay it forward game. Make sure that you start thinking about, what can I do for others? What could I offer in their situations? But also then balance empathy with self-care, because you need to be able to recharge. Otherwise, you run into this issue of compassion fatigue that happens when we don't care about ourselves before offering our help to others. Now, what are the key takeaways here? I would say there are 3 forms of empathy, and all of them are really important, and it's great to have them in a balanced way. Because if you show all 3 of them, the person that you're interacting with will feel seen and heard and understood. Now, let me encourage you, maybe for the next few days, for the next week, think about those 3 types of empathy and start observing yourself and also others when you're interacting with them. What type of empathy do you tend to go towards? Is it more emotional empathy? Is it cognitive empathy? Is it compassionate empathy? Or is it a combination of the 3? You could also think about situations in the past and what type of empathy have you used there. And the same way, you can also observe others. What type of empathy are they leveraging? Now, the bad news is that there is another form of empathy, the variation of cognitive empathy, and that is called dark empathy. This happens if you have a person with a very strong cognitive empathy. So a person that really understands others and understands their needs and their perspectives and their values, but have little compassion. So they understand really well how others think and feel, but instead instead of using this insight to help the other person, they use it to manipulate and also to control and to deceive people. Now, people who are showing this type of empathy, this dark empathy, usually are people that also show traits that are called the dark. So a person that is demonstrating Machiavellianism, which means that they are manipulating others for their own benefits. People with narcissism. So they use the empathy to feed their own ego and to be admired by everyone. And also psychopaths who understand others, but they lack the emotional attachment. So they don't have this emotional empathy for others. And they all don't even feel guilt when they're causing harm. Now, this means people who use this dark empathy, they usually are emotionally detached from consequences of those actions. They might understand what the others are feeling, but they do not experience this emotional empathy nor the desire to help the other person. And that can happen wherever you find these people in the workplace, you find these people in the personal relationships. And people with dark empathy, they can be really highly skilled at manipulating emotions. So they have a really high cognitive empathy and they lack the other two components. That really can lead to harm and even to long-term psychological damage. So if you suspect that there is someone in your environment that has this type of dark empathy associated with them, watch out for manipulation. Look for signs whether someone is using really their understanding of your emotions to control you, to steer you in ways that only benefits them at the end. In that case, it's really important to set boundaries. So clear emotional and physical boundaries. And be mindful because, as I said, these people are pretty skilled at also pushing your boundaries. So it's really important to be very firm in that perspective. And also be aware of your emotions. So when you interact with someone else, think about, feel your own emotions. And if you feel that interactions with this other person make you feel bad, if you feel guilty, maybe dependent, maybe less confident, it might be a sign that this other person is leveraging empathy to manipulate. So while empathy is really a great thing, and there are a lot of people out there talking about the empathetic leader as being the best way of leadership, because we want to be able to listen to others. We want to be able to take the other person into account, their values, their emotions, their visions. Also be aware of this dark empathy because it can be really a dangerous flip side of this cognitive empathy. So we could say that empathy is not inherently positive, but of course it is if we use it with good intentions. And I think that's an important statement overall. Whatever I do is driven and highly impacted by my intent. So for example, in the trust technique, we start every interaction with one sentence, which is, how can I help you? And that puts us in this perspective of actually compassionate empathy. So we're there to listen, we're there to understand, and then we're there to help the other person if needs be. And I think that's a wonderful way of approaching every interaction we have with other human beings and animals for that matter. So that was it for this week. Of course, I would love to hear from you what type of empathy you use most and what is most natural to you. Is it all three? Is it one of them? And I look forward to hearing from you. And I wish you a wonderful week with a lot of positive, empathetic interactions. Thank you. Bye bye.
This was Lead Well. Now, what is the one thing that you're taking away from this episode? Please share in the comments below and do share the podcast with your friends and family, but only if you like it.